Most of us were taught that American slavery ended with a single document, the Emancipation Proclamation. One signature, one historic moment. And suddenly, millions of people were free. But history is rarely that simple. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, freedom did not arrive everywhere at once. In reality, emancipation depended on something far more powerful than words on paper: the presence of Union soldiers. In many places, enslaved people remained in bondage not for days or weeks, but for months, even years after slavery was declared over. Imagine waking up on a plantation where nothing looks different. The same fields, the same overseer, the same rules. You have heard whispers that freedom exists somewhere beyond the horizon, but no one has come to confirm it. No official announcement, no protection, no guarantee that leaving one tea cost you your life. For millions of formerly enslaved people, freedom arrived unevenly and unpredictably. Some learned the news from Union troops marching into town. Others heard it from recruiters, newspapers, or strangers passing through. And some were never told at all. Their owners chose silence, hoping to hold on to control for just a little longer. This video explores what truly happened in those uncertain days, how freedom was announced, delayed, negotiated, and sometimes resisted. We will hear real voices from the past and uncover stories that rarely make it into textbooks. If you are interested in uncovering the hidden realities behind well-known moments in history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps support in-depth storytelling like this and ensures these forgotten stories continue to be told. As freedom spread unevenly across the defeated Confederacy, silence became one of the most powerful tools left in the hands of former slave owners. In places where Union troops had not yet arrived, the law existed only on paper, and many plantation owners understood this all too well. They realized that as long as information could be controlled, labor could be preserved, crops could still be planted, and daily life could continue as if nothing had changed. Emancipation, for the enslaved, was not always announced with proclamations or celebrations. Often, it was delayed by deliberate omission. On countless plantations, the days after Lincoln's declaration looked no different from the days before it. Enslaved people rose before dawn, worked under the same supervision, and returned to the same quarters at night, unaware that the legal foundation of slavery had already collapsed elsewhere. Rumors circulated quietly, passed between workers in the fields or whispered after dark, but without confirmation. Leaving carried enormous risk. To walk away without protection could mean starvation, violence, or capture. Plantation owners relied on that uncertainty, knowing fear could be as effective as force. Some masters justified their silence by claiming they were protecting those under their authority, arguing that freedom would only bring chaos or suffering. Others framed their control as mutual dependence, suggesting that without guidance, formerly enslaved people would not survive. Yet beneath these explanations lay a simple motive: labor was still needed, and the harvest still mattered. Each day of withheld information meant another day of unpaid work, another step toward financial survival in a collapsing Southern economy. In many cases, the truth emerged slowly and unevenly. A passerby might mention Union victories. A newspaper discarded in town could carry news of surrender. A soldier, recruiter, or federal official might finally arrive and speak words that plantation owners had avoided. When that moment came, reactions varied. Some enslaved people left immediately, carrying little more than hope. Others hesitated, stunned by the realization that their lives had already changed without their knowledge. For them, freedom did not feel like a sudden release, but like a revelation that arrived too late. The delay itself carried lasting consequences. By withholding the truth, former masters shaped the terms of transition, often positioning themselves as employers rather than owners, offering wages only after contracts were signed or crops were gathered. What appeared to be generosity was often strategy, designed to preserve authority under a new name. The power dynamic shifted, but it did not disappear. Control simply adapted to new conditions. This manipulation of information reveals an uncomfortable reality about emancipation. Freedom was not merely granted, it had to be discovered, claimed, and sometimes defended. The end of slavery was not marked by a clear line between past and future, but by a murky period where truth moved slowly and unevenly, shaped by those who still had something to lose. In that space between law and reality, silence became a final weapon, delaying liberation not through chains, but through withheld words. As the truth about emancipation slowly emerged and silence gave way to uneasy acknowledgement, another reality became clear, one that challenges modern assumptions about what freedom should have looked like in practice. While some formerly enslaved people left plantations the moment they learned of their new legal status, many others did not. To outside observers, staying behind might seem like a choice rooted in loyalty or hesitation. But for those living through the moment, it was often a decision shaped by fear, survival, and deeply human attachments. For elderly men and women who had spent their entire lives in bondage, freedom arrived without a roadmap. Many were in their 70s or 80s, their bodies worn down by decades of labor, their strength already fading. Leaving the plantation meant venturing into a world that offered no guarantees of shelter, food, or medical care. There were no pensions, safety, and no institutions prepared to absorb thousands of aging people overnight. Remaining in familiar surroundings, even under imperfect conditions, felt safer than stepping into complete uncertainty. Family ties also played a powerful role in these decisions. On many plantations, families had survived years of separation and loss, clinging tightly to the few connections that remained intact. Freedom threatened to scatter those bonds once again. Parents feared being separated from children who had nowhere else to go. Grandparents worried about abandoning younger relatives who depended on them. Staying together, even temporarily, often mattered more than pursuing independence immediately. In this fragile moment, unity became a form of protection. Fear, too, cast a long shadow. Emancipation did not erase hostility, and many formerly enslaved people understood that the wider society was not suddenly welcoming. Violence, intimidation, and retaliation were real concerns, especially in rural areas far from Union protection. Stories circulated of people who left and were turned away, harassed, or worse. For those who had lived under constant threat, caution was not weakness but wisdom. Staying put allowed them to observe, assess, and wait for signs that freedom could be sustained. There was also the weight of psychological conditioning, built over generations. Enslavement had shaped how people viewed authority, security, and risk. The plantation, despite its cruelty, was a known world with familiar rhythms and expectations. Freedom required not only physical movement but a mental leap, a reimagining of one's place in society. That transition could not always happen overnight. For some, remaining was not a rejection of freedom but a pause, a moment to gather strength before stepping into the unknown. This period reveals a deeper truth about emancipation. Liberation is not defined solely by the act of leaving. For many, freedom began as a gradual process, marked by negotiation, adaptation, and endurance. The decision to stay was often a survival strategy, not submission. It reflected the complex realities faced by people who had been denied autonomy for a lifetime and were now expected to navigate a world that offered freedom in name but little else in support. While some remained behind to weigh their options or protect fragile family ties, others felt the pull of freedom with an urgency that could not be contained. For younger and healthier freed people, emancipation was not only a legal change but a call to action. Their bodies still carried strength, their minds carried hope, and their sense of time was different. They believed that waiting too long might mean losing the narrow window that freedom had opened. For them, staying on the plantation felt less like caution and more like surrender. When word of emancipation finally reached them, many left with little preparation. Some walked away at dawn, carrying only what they could hold, stepping onto roads they had never been allowed to travel before. They moved toward towns, rail lines, and rivers, guided by rumors of opportunity and the distant presence of Union forces. Each step away from the plantation was both an act of courage and a leap into uncertainty. But for these younger individuals, the risk felt necessary. Freedom, they believed, had to be claimed before it could be taken back. One powerful path forward was military service. The Union Army represented more than a uniform and a paycheck. It offered protection, purpose, and recognition. Enlistment turned former enslaved people into soldiers of the nation that had declared them free. For many young men, joining the army was a way to assert dignity and agency, to transform themselves from property into participants in history, marching under a flag, earning wages, and standing armed before those who once claimed ownership carried symbolic weight that cannot be overstated. Others followed a different route, driven by a hunger for learning that had been denied for generations. Schools established by missionary groups and aid organizations became destinations of hope. Education promised more than literacy. It offered a future beyond field labor, a chance to define life on new terms. Young freed people walked miles to attend classes held in churches, abandoned buildings, or makeshift classrooms. Often studying by candlelight after long days of work, knowledge became a form of resistance, a quiet but powerful assertion of self-worth. Employment also drew many away from plantations. Towns and cities, though far from welcoming, offered wages, mobility, and a chance to negotiate labor rather than endure it. Even when pay was low and conditions harsh, the simple act of choosing where to work carried meaning. Leaving the plantation was not just about escape. It was about redefining identity. These young men and women were no longer bound to a single place or master. They were workers, students, soldiers, and migrants shaping their own paths. Their departures altered the landscape of the post-war South. Plantations lost much of their youngest labor force, accelerating economic change and unsettling old hierarchies. More importantly, these movements demonstrated that freedom was not a passive gift, but an active pursuit. While some took time to step forward, others ran toward the unknown, driven by strength, ambition, and belief in a future that, for the first time, felt possible. As younger freed people departed and others cautiously remained, the structure of plantation life did not simply disappear. Instead, it transformed. Former masters, facing the collapse of an economy built on forced labor, searched for ways to preserve productivity while adapting to a new legal reality. What emerged was a system that appeared modern on the surface, but carried familiar patterns beneath it. Labor contracts became the bridge between slavery and a new form of dependence, one that relied not on ownership, but on obligation. These agreements were often presented as reasonable and even generous. Freed people were told they would receive wages, housing, and a share of the crop in exchange for their labor. For those with limited options, the offer sounded like stability in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. Many could not read the contracts placed before them, and few had access to independent advice. Trust, habit, and necessity filled the gap where choice should have been. Signing a contract felt safer than leaving, even if the terms were unclear. In practice, these arrangements tilted power firmly in one direction. Payment was frequently delayed until harvest, ensuring that workers remained tied to the land for months at a time. Expenses for tools, food, and supplies were deducted from future earnings, creating debts that were difficult to escape. Each season began with promises and ended with balances that never seemed to favor the laborer. Freedom existed in name, but movement was constrained by numbers written in ledgers controlled by someone else. This system, later known as sharecropping, spread rapidly across the South. It thrived on inequality and limited access to alternatives for formerly enslaved people who lacked land, savings, or protection. Walking away from a contract could mean losing shelter and livelihood. The law recognized them as free individuals, yet economic pressure narrowed their choices until staying felt inevitable. Control no longer came through chains, but through calculations and contracts that locked people into cycles of dependence. What made this transition especially complex was how it blended old relationships with new rules. Former masters often framed themselves as benefactors, emphasizing continuity and familiarity. They spoke of mutual cooperation, urging freed people to stay and work together as they always had, only now under a different arrangement. This language softened the reality of unequal power and masked how little had truly changed. The plantation remained the center of life, and authority still flowed from the same direction. For many freed people, accepting these contracts was not a failure of ambition but a response to limited options. The broader society offered little support for land ownership or independent farming. Opportunities elsewhere were distant and uncertain. In this context, labor agreements became a survival strategy, a way to navigate freedom without falling into immediate hardship. Yet over time, the weight of accumulated debt and restricted mobility revealed the system's true cost. This phase of emancipation underscores a crucial truth. The end of slavery did not automatically dismantle exploitation. It reshaped it by converting ownership into obligation. Former masters preserved influence while adapting to the letter of the law. For freed people, the struggle shifted from breaking physical bonds to confronting economic ones, proving that freedom, without fairness and opportunity, could still feel painfully constrained. As contracts tightened their grip on those who stayed and opportunities drew others away, a new set of figures began to appear across the southern countryside, carrying with them authority that plantation owners could no longer ignore. Union recruiters and federal officials moved from town to town, plantation to plantation, serving as living proof that emancipation was no longer just a rumor or a distant promise. Their arrival often marked the first moment when freedom became undeniable, spoken aloud by men backed by uniforms, documents, and the power of the state. In many rural areas, these officials were the first to publicly announce that slavery had ended. They read proclamations, displayed printed notices, and explained changes that few fully understood. For people who had been deliberately kept in the dark, hearing those words from a federal representative carried a weight that whispers never could. Emancipation became real not because of ink on parchment, but because someone stood before them and said it was so, with soldiers and law to support the claim. Protection was just as important as information. Leaving a plantation without backing could be dangerous, and recruiters often became escorts as much as messengers. They intervened when former masters objected, stood between freed people and threats, and made it clear that attempts to reverse emancipation would not be tolerated. Their presence shifted the balance of power, even if only temporarily, giving freed people the confidence to make decisions that had previously felt impossible. Enlistment in the Union Army offered one of the clearest paths forward. For many freed men, joining the military was both practical and symbolic, provided wages, food, and shelter, but it also offered status and protection in a hostile environment. Recruiters explained that service was voluntary, yet the opportunity carried profound meaning. Wearing a uniform transformed identity, signaling that former enslaved people were now defenders of the nation rather than its property. This shift challenged long-held assumptions about citizenship and belonging. The act of recruitment also spread emancipation faster than official channels alone could have managed. As men enlisted and returned to their communities in uniform, they became visible evidence of change. Stories traveled with them, reinforcing the message that freedom was enforceable and that participation in national life was possible. In this way, the army became not only a fighting force, but a moving network of information, protection, and transformation. Yet the role of Union officials was not without tension. Their resources were limited, and they could not remain everywhere indefinitely. Once they moved on, freed people were often left to navigate fragile circumstances on their own. Still, their impact was undeniable. They broke through silence, disrupted attempts to preserve control, and created openings where none had existed before. In the broader story of emancipation, these recruiters and officials served as catalysts. They connected law to lived experience, turning abstract declarations into actionable reality. By announcing freedom, shielding those who claimed it, and opening doors to service and mobility, they helped ensure that emancipation was not merely declared, but enacted, one community at a time. Even as the proclamations were read and Union recruiters moved through the South, freedom did not arrive as a single, uncomplicated emotion. The people who had lived under the weight of bondage for generations found themselves confronting a spectrum of feelings that could not be easily categorized. Joy and relief were immediate and undeniable for many. The simple knowledge that they were no longer legally property was exhilarating, a moment that validated years of suffering and resilience. Yet alongside that exhilaration came anxiety, an awareness that the world beyond the plantation was unfamiliar and often unwelcoming. Freedom had been promised, but survival was not guaranteed, and the unknown stretched out before them like an endless horizon. First-hand accounts paint a vivid picture of this emotional complexity. Some describe jubilation on the day they learned of emancipation, dancing, singing, and embracing one another with tears of happiness. Others recalled a quieter, more solemn response, where the weight of responsibility settled on shoulders unaccustomed to autonomy. For the elderly and infirm, freedom meant new vulnerabilities. For the young and able-bodied, it meant decisions about direction, work, and safety that had previously been dictated by someone else. These emotions coexisted, sometimes within the same person, as the reality emancipation slowly sank in. Uncertainty was a constant companion. Many freed people questioned what steps to take first. Should they remain on the land that had been both home and prison, seek new opportunities elsewhere, or join the military in hopes of protection and purpose? Each choice carried risks. Leaving could expose them to hostility, exploitation, or even violence from those unwilling to accept the new social order. Staying could mean economic dependence or coercion under labor contracts designed to mimic the structures of slavery. The decisions were rarely simple, and each path required courage, judgment, and, often, improvisation in a world still structured to disadvantage them. Concern about survival extended beyond the immediate moment. Formerly enslaved individuals were acutely aware that freedom did not automatically come with food, shelter, or community support. The systems that had once maintained their oppression had crumbled legally, but the social and economic landscape remained treacherous. Widespread prejudice, the threat of retaliatory violence, and limited access to resources meant that joy was inseparable from vigilance. Even celebrations of emancipation were tempered by the knowledge that survival required constant attention, adaptation, and resilience. At the same time, freedom inspired hope. People dreamed of learning to read, owning land, raising children in safety, and participating in a society that had long excluded them. They envisioned communities where decisions were their own and futures were not predetermined by the whims of others. Yet hope was fragile, always shadowed by the lingering effects of centuries of oppression and the uncertainty of whether newfound liberties would be protected or rescinded. In this tension between possibility and danger, the experience of emancipation became a deeply human story, one of mixed emotions, of cautious optimism, of sorrow and elation intertwined. These first-hand perspectives remind us that emancipation was not a single moment of liberation, but a process of emotional reckoning. The thrill of freedom came with questions, fears, and responsibilities that had never before belonged to those who had been enslaved. To understand the period fully is to recognize this complexity, to see joy and fear living side by side, and to grasp that claiming freedom required both courage and resilience in a society still poised against the newly liberated. As the story of emancipation unfolded across the United States, one date came to embody both the triumph and the unfinished work of freedom. June 19, 1860. On that day, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to deliver the news that all enslaved people in the state were free. Though the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued more than 2 years earlier, its promises had taken time to reach the farthest corners of the Confederacy. Juneteenth, therefore, is more than a celebration of legal freedom. It is a reminder of the delays, the obstacles, and the long road that lay ahead for those who had finally been declared free. Juneteenth highlights the reality that emancipation was never instantaneous. Across the South, many enslaved people remained unaware of their legal status for months or even years, while some were coerced into labor contracts that maintained the structures of economic dependence under new names. Even after the arrival of Union troops and federal officials, the challenges of securing land, wages, education, and protection were immense. Legal freedom alone could not erase centuries of systemic oppression, nor could it instantly provide the tools needed to thrive in a society that had long denied basic rights and opportunities. In this way, Juneteenth serves as both a celebration and a sober reflection on the complexities of freedom. The holiday also became a cultural touchstone, a time for African American communities to gather, honor their ancestors, and assert the dignity that had been long denied. Early celebrations were centered on community, music, food, and storytelling, providing space to remember those who had endured bondage and to envision a future shaped by agency and resilience. Over time, Juneteenth grew beyond local traditions into a national symbol, reminding all Americans that freedom and equality require vigilance, effort, and collective recognition. It underscores that the journey from legal emancipation to true social and economic equality is ongoing, and that the story of freedom is not a single event, but a continuing process. The lessons of Juneteenth resonate today. It teaches us that liberation must be paired with opportunity, that justice extends beyond laws on paper, and that the fight for dignity and equality requires both courage and persistence. It also reminds us of the human stories behind historical milestones, the fears, the hopes, and the decisions of individuals navigating a world transformed overnight yet still resistant to change. By reflecting on these narratives, we gain a deeper understanding of the sacrifices and achievements of those who claimed their freedom and the work that remains to ensure it is meaningful for all. If you found this story insightful, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of history's hidden truths. Sharing your thoughts in the comments helps keep these conversations alive, and subscribing ensures you won't miss our next journey into the past. Thank you for watching, and remember to celebrate not only the victories of history, but also the resilience, courage, and humanity that made them possible.